Welcome! Today we're going on a virtual tour of an animal and plant cell to help explain to you all of the myriad structures and functions that take place in cells. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy your closer look into cells. So, here's our animal cell. As you'll notice, there are a lot of smaller parts to this cell. If you remember, these smaller parts are called organelles, and each one of them does a specific job for the cell. In fact, organelles function in much the same way as the organs found in your body. For example, your brain controls most aspects of your body, functioning in the same way that the DNA inside the cell's nucleus controls its functioning. So, let's take a more detailed look now at the organelles found in animal cells and what exactly their functions are. So, the first organelle you'd run into if you were trying to visit the interior of the cell is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is made up of a bilayer, or two layers, of phospholipid molecules. Remember, phospholipids are molecules that have a phosphate head and two fatty acid tails, shown here. Interspersed between the phospholipid molecules are various types of proteins. You can see the proteins here in purple. And, as you'll notice by their names, they each do a very specific job, which we'll look at more later. Lastly, we have molecules of cholesterol, packed in between the phospholipids. Cholesterol molecules help the cell membrane to be fluid, or malleable. It helps it to move. Every one of these molecules plays an important role in the main function of the membrane. This main role is maintenance of homeostasis in the cell, through regulation of what goes into and out of the cell. This property of the cell membrane is called selective permeability. It's selective in what it allows across the membrane. The cell membrane also acts as a barrier, separating the interior contents of the cell from the cell's exterior environment. And, last but not least, the cell membrane helps to maintain the shape of the cell. Now, let's move into the interior of the cell. The next organelle we'd likely run into is the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton acts to help maintain structural support for the cell, like cell shape, anchoring organelles, and also facilitating cellular movement. Lastly, it helps to regulate and structure activities in the cell. There are three different types of fibers in the cytoskeleton. They range from small in diameter to much thicker. The largest is the microtubules. The intermediate in size is appropriately named the intermediate filaments. Lastly, the smallest in size are the microfilaments. Here's a great picture showing the relative size of each. Notice that the microtubules and microfilaments are relatively linear, while the intermediate filaments form a web-like network. Let's look at each one separately. First, we have the microtubules, the tubbiest and largest of our filaments. These large filaments are made up of a protein called tubulin. These tubules are what make up structures in the cell called centrioles, which pull apart chromosomes during cell division. These tubules are also what make up flagella and cilia on the surface of cells, which both aid in cellular movement. Flagella is used on sperm cells for motility, and cilia is found on the surface of respiratory cells in your nasal passages and help move mucus and trapped foreign particles like dust and allergens to the stomach for digestion. They help keep you well. Microfilaments, or the thinnest fibers, are made out of a protein called actin. These thin filaments help to maintain cell shape. And just as an aside, we also find actin protein in the filaments of our muscles, so they also help our muscles contract. Intermediate filaments, or the in-between in size, are made up of the protein keratin, which we talked about already in relation to hair and our nails. These filaments work to anchor organelles in the cell and also to reinforce cell shape. So, take a moment and make sure that you have at least the summary of each type of cytoskeleton fiber down in your notes. You never know when you might see it again. Wink, wink. Now, we'll move on to the nucleus. The job of the nucleus is to house and protect DNA. The nucleus is surrounded by a membrane called the nuclear membrane, or nuclear envelope. It's a double layer of phospholipids just like the cell membrane. As you see here, the nuclear membrane has a series of pores that allow substances to enter and exit. Inside of the nucleus, there's another organelle called the nucleolus. More on that in a second. We also find the chromatin here. Chromatin is DNA that has been packaged by wrapping it around a type of protein called a histone. Then, when cells get ready to divide, it gets packaged even denser into the structures you know as chromosomes. Okay, let's go back to the nucleolus. Remember, it's a small circular organelle found within the nucleus. Its function is to produce the parts that will eventually be assembled into ribosomes. So we can in effect say that it creates the ribosomes. You may be asking yourself, what are ribosomes? Well, I've got an answer for you. Ribosomes can be thought of like the factories of the cell. Their whole job is to produce a wonderful and much needed product called protein. They are made up of two units, which you can think of as a top and a bottom. There are two types of ribosomes in the cell. There are free ribosomes, and that means that they are standalone protein producers and are not part of another organelle. And then we have bound ribosomes, which are part of another organelle, and that organelle is called the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, often simply called the ER, is a collection of membranous folds that are connected to the nucleus. This allows the ribosomal parts that are being made by the nucleolus to easily reach their new home in the ER. There are two basic types of ER, the rough and the smooth. The rough ER has ribosomes embedded within it, and the smooth ER does not. The ER acts much like an international space station. Once the ribosomes in the ER have made the protein, it makes its way through the maze of ER tunnels until it reaches a terminus. Once there, it's packaged into a vesicle, which is created by a piece of the ER membrane pinching off around it, and it's sent then to our next organelle, the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus looks much like the endoplasmic reticulum in its appearance. That's because it too is a series of flattened folds made out of membrane. It, however, is not attached to the nucleus. The Golgi apparatus receives the vesicles filled with protein from the ER, and then it modifies the protein. It tags it with the destination location and then repackages the protein into another vesicle for shipment outside of the cell. You can think of the Golgi like a post office. Liver cells are an example of a type of cell that might have a lot of Golgi bodies, another name for the Golgi apparatus. Liver cells help to rid your body of toxins, which are broken down and processed and often sent to other parts of the body. Next up, we have lysosomes. Lysosomes sound a lot like the word Lysol, which makes sense because they act as the cleanup crews of the cells. Lysosomes are very small. They're membrane-bound sacs, like vesicles. However, these guys contain powerful and acidic digestive enzymes inside of them that work to break down anything that they come across, from macromolecules to whole organelles. This picture shows how lysosomes often fuse together with food vacuoles, which store food in cells, and then help to break down their contents. They're like little cellular stomachs. We already talked about vesicles, but they warrant their own slide. Vesicles are the vehicles of cells. They take care of transporting substances around the cell's interior. They're simply small sacs of membrane with a hollow space in the center for transporting proteins or other things. They are created when the ER, or the Golgi apparatus, pinches off a small portion of their membrane. Pretty cool, huh? So the last several organelles that we just talked about make up a very important system inside of cells. It kind of acts like an organ system might act in your body. And this system is called the endomembrane system. And it acts to create and transport proteins in the cell. The key players in this system are the nucleolus, the ribosomes, the ER, the Golgi apparatus, and lastly, the lysosomes. Here's a picture of the entire thing. If I were you, I would know the organelles in this system and how they contribute to it. Next up is one of the most important organelles in cells, the mighty mitochondria. The mitochondria's function in the cell is to produce ATP. ATP is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. It's the energy currency in cells. When cells expend energy, it costs ATP, and when cells make energy, it's banked as ATP. So as you can tell, ATP is highly prized in cells. The mitochondria produce this ATP through a special process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a unique series of chemical reactions that use oxygen to create ATP from glucose. But we'll talk about that much more later. The mitochondria has a bilayer membrane surrounding it. The outer membrane is smooth, but the inner membrane is highly folded. That's because the more surface area that there is on that membrane, the more enzymes can reside there and be making ATP. Naturally, there are many enzymes found in the mitochondria that help in this process of cellular respiration. The mitochondria also even has its own ribosomes to make its own protein. And the mitochondria has its own DNA. Crazy, huh? I bet you thought DNA was only in a cell's nucleus. Interestingly enough, the DNA found in the mitochondria only comes from your mother and not your father. So mitochondrial DNA is a wonderful tool in helping to create genealogies. As you can imagine, certain cells need a lot of mitochondria because certain cells have really high energy needs, like muscle cells. In fact, muscle cells can have thousands and thousands of mitochondria in just one cell. Nerve cells are also another type of cell that have a bunch. So, we've completed our tour of an animal cell. I hope that by learning all about the organelles and what each of them does, you're even more amazed by your own bodies. Before we finish, we just need to talk about the 3 extra structures that plant cells have that aren't found in animal cells. One of the first big differences in plant cells is the cell wall. The cell wall in a plant cell is a rigid, almost boxy structure that adds an extra layer of support and structure for our green friends that lack bones. It's found on the outside of the cell, just past the cell membrane. Yes, plants still have a cell membrane. Plant cell walls are made up of cellulose, which, as you remember, is a complex carbohydrate that is only partially digested by our systems. Plants also have a large central vacuole, which acts much like a water tower. This membrane-bound sac stores water, sometimes pigments, and sometimes even toxins. It's usually located centrally in a plant cell, and when it's properly filled, it helps to support the cell and give it its shape. When you don't water your plants for a while and it starts to wilt, it's due to an empty central vacuole, which is causing the plant cell to slightly cave in on itself. So be sure to water your plants regularly. There are other types of vacuoles found in other organisms too. For example, we have food vacuoles in our cells, which we talked about earlier, and in some protists there are contractile vacuoles. And these act like a sump pump, and they help to pump out extra water in these creatures so that they don't explode. Lastly, in plant cells, we have the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are organelles in plants that help to create their own food. This is accomplished by the process of photosynthesis. Plants basically use air, water, and sunlight to make sugar. Amazing, right? The chloroplast also has a double membrane, and inside of the membrane there are stacks of disc-shaped structures called thylakoids. Thylakoids contain the enzymes that are working to photosynthesize. So, the more thylakoids, the more membrane. And the more membrane, the more chemical reactions we can have going. Surface area is really an important thing in cells. Just like mitochondria, chloroplasts also have their own ribosomes and DNA. So remember when we discussed the theory of endosymbiosis, which is that the mitochondria and chloroplast organelles originated from a larger bacteria engulfing a smaller one? Well, all of these things are great pieces of evidence to support that theory. Just like cells, both the chloroplast and mitochondria can generate their own energy. They both have a bilayer membrane. They can both move, change shape, and divide on their own inside of cells, and they both have their own genetic material, ribosomes and enzymes. It's almost like they are their own living organisms inside of us. It's like Alien. Just kidding. No, really. No, just kidding. Anyway, so this completes our tour of a plant cell. They too are pretty amazing little machines. Let's end with reviewing the 4 structures that all cells have. All cells have DNA, and that's important because it controls the activities of the cell. Ribosomes, because all cells need to produce protein. Cytoplasm, which fills out the shape of our cells. And a cell membrane, which is really important again for maintaining that homeostasis. Okay, so review your organelle shapes, locations, and functions in preparation for our next exciting activity.